The valley lay quiet under a pale dawn sky, wrapped in a low blanket of silver fog that drifted slowly across the fields like a patient memory refusing to fade. Past the creek and beyond the rows of weather-beaten pines stood a modest farmhouse, its white paint chipped and worn by years of wind, rain, and time. It wasn't a palace and it wasn't new, but it carried the kind of character forged by hard work and scars that refused to heal. This was the home of Eleanor Hayes, a widowed farm owner struggling to hold on to the last piece of life she once knew. Eleanor had not always lived alone. There had been a time when the property hummed with laughter, ironwork, and the steady rhythm of purpose. Her husband, Samuel Hayes, had been a craftsman, builder, and man of remarkable patience, someone who built things to last. His workshop sat just to the east of the farmhouse, a sturdy wooden structure he had built by hand long before the land was swallowed into Whispering Ridge estates and placed under the jurisdiction of the newly formed Homeowners Association. Back then the land had been free, no rules, no board, no strangers pretending to own rights they never earned. Samuel was gone now, a quiet tragedy that had struck one winter morning 3 years earlier when his heart failed him out in the fields. No warnings, no goodbyes. One moment he was working, the next he was a memory. Since that day, Eleanor had carried the burden of both grief and survival. She worked the land alone, kept the fields trimmed, and maintained the old house as best as she could. But she kept that workshop exactly as Samuel had left it. It stood there not as a structure but as a tribute, a reminder of the man who had built every inch of their life together. It was more than wood and nails, it was legacy. That legacy became a target. The first letter came in a crisp white envelope, pressed with an embossed seal bearing 3 letters Eleanor had come to despise: HOA Whispering Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She had never asked to be a part of it. Her land had been annexed when the developers bought everything around her and forced rural landowners into a suburban contract. She had ignored their flyers, their meetings, their surveys. She owned her land. She paid her taxes. She needed no permission to exist, but the HOA thought differently. Their letter was polite but sharp, like a velvet glove hiding a knife. It informed her that her late husband's workshop violated community visual standards. New guidelines had been approved requiring secondary structures to meet architectural conformity. Terms like unauthorized construction and structural noncompliance filled the page like a foreign language. The letter demanded she remove the workshop within 30 days or face escalating fines and legal action. The second letter came 2 weeks later. This one was not polite. It accused her of ignoring prior notice and listed an initial fine of $2,500, increasing daily. It referred to her workshop as an eyesore and an unregistered structure, as if it were some kind of contraband. The letter ended with a threat that made Eleanor's blood turn cold. Failure to comply may result in lien action against your property. That one sentence was enough to send a chill deeper than any February wind. It meant they could take her land. She had lived through loss before, but losing the land would mean losing Samuel all over again. Eleanor's first instinct was disbelief. She had heard stories of ridiculous HOA disputes in the suburbs, grass height, mailbox color, garden decor, but this was her ranch, her livelihood. The workshop wasn't modern, but it was clean, safe, and weatherproof. It wasn't hurting anyone, it wasn't intruding on anyone, yet the HOA wanted it gone simply because it did not match the visual harmony of the neighborhood. Whispering Ridge Estates had changed the valley. What had once been wide stretches of farmland had been carved up into cul-de-sacs, circular drives, and luxury cabins disguised as country homes. Its residents were not farmers or craftsmen. They were outsiders, retirees escaping the city, tech workers who wanted scenic mountain views, people who loved the concept of country life but hated the authenticity of it. They brought rules, committees, restrictions, and now their board of directors declared that Samuel's workshop didn't belong. Eleanor folded the letter and set it down, but she did not destroy it. She did not cry. Instead, she walked across the yard and stood in front of the workshop. Dusty windows, metal tools hanging neatly on the walls inside, a lantern still hanging from a wooden beam. Samuel's initials carved into the doorframe. To her, this place was sacred, but to the HOA, it was just another violation. She considered her options. She could ignore them. She could fight them. She could call a lawyer she couldn't afford. She could beg for mercy from people who had none. But Eleanor Hayes had been raised by land and labor. Her husband had taught her that the only way to deal with bullies was to not bow down. She had already lost too much. She was not going to lose this. But she had no idea yet that this fight would uncover something much bigger than a workshop violation. Something buried, something corrupted, something the HOA had spent years hiding. She thought she was defending her land. She didn't know yet she was about to declare war. The next morning she drove into town to gather whatever information she could about property rights, land use laws, and HOA jurisdiction. The local county clerk gave her a stack of dense legal documents that made her head spin, but one thing stood out. The HOA did not legally exist when the workshop was built. Samuel had constructed it 15 years ago. Whispering Ridge Estates HOA was formed only 7 years ago. That meant it could not legally impose retroactive architectural laws on pre-existing structures. That discovery gave Eleanor hope, fleeting but powerful. However, hope vanished when she returned home to find a fresh notice pinned to her front door: final warning before lien placement. The fines had now grown to $18,300. The letter was signed by Meredith Crane, HOA president. A name Eleanor would soon come to know very well, too well. Meredith Crane was known in town even before the HOA existed. Wealthy, controlling, a self-appointed guardian of community standards, she had influence, money, and the kind of political connections that made people nervous. Eleanor suspected Meredith had personal motives. This felt targeted, intentional, vindictive. What Eleanor did not know was that Meredith had far more to hide than Eleanor could imagine. And the workshop was only the excuse, a distraction in a much larger scheme. The fight was no longer about aesthetics. It was about power. As dusk fell across the valley, Eleanor stood once more in the doorway of Samuel's workshop. The air was heavy. The horizon burned orange. Somewhere in the distance, a storm was gathering. And though she didn't yet understand the path ahead, she knew this: she would not run, she would not bend, and she would not give up. If the HOA wanted a battle, then she would give them something they had never faced before: resistance with roots deeper than any law they could write. The land held secrets. The HOA held lies. And soon those worlds were going to collide. Morning came with the stubborn gray of a sky that refused to clear. Eleanor awoke exhausted, not from sleep but from the weight of what lay ahead. Her kitchen table was buried in papers, fines, violation notices, copies of county zoning laws, and property agreements dating back decades. The Whispering Ridge Estates HOA claimed authority over her land, but the more she read, the more she uncovered inconsistencies. The documents referenced restrictive covenants that had never been filed with the county clerk. The legal descriptions of her property didn't match the association's maps. Their letters quoted policies that did not exist in any public record. Something was wrong, very wrong. She had planned to spend the day gathering legal support, but fate interrupted. A truck rolled slowly up her dirt road, tires grinding against gravel. It wasn't a friendly visit. She could always tell by the way certain vehicles approached: slow, measured, self-important. This one belonged to the HOA. Three people stepped out: Meredith Crane, wearing a tailored blazer unsuited for country dirt, her posture radiating practiced superiority. Behind her stood Victor Saunders, the HOA treasurer, whose face bore the expression of a man who believed his signature held real power. The third was a lawyer, anonymous, in a cold gray suit, carrying a briefcase and wearing the permanent smirk of someone accustomed to scaring people with paperwork. They had come not to negotiate, but to deliver a warning. Meredith surveyed the property with a calm cruelty. Her eyes moved across the fields and fences before pausing on the workshop, as though it personally offended her existence. She stepped toward it as if she already owned it. Eleanor didn't speak. Words were useless in the presence of people like this, people who hid behind rules they created. The attorney produced a thick envelope: legal intimidation by design. Inside was a notice of lien intent and cease and desist order, now expanded to include the barn roof, her tractor shelter, and even her fencing. The HOA had escalated. They claimed her workshop violated code. Now they were attacking everything she owned. Each structure had been labeled an unauthorized outbuilding. This was not enforcement, this was aggression. The lawyer explained that they were filing a lien within 72 hours. The lien would prevent her from selling, refinancing, or legally opposing HOA action unless fines were paid. Fines that had now accumulated to over $28,000, an impossible number for a widow farmer living season to season. The threat was clear: comply or lose everything. But Eleanor was no fool. She knew what this really was. They wanted her land. Whispering Ridge Estates had reached its final phase of development. Everything around her had been sold, built, and marketed to new buyers. Everything except her land. Her property sat on the only elevation in the valley with sweeping views of the mountains. Developers wanted it for a luxury lodge or a private club. And Meredith Crane, whose husband ran the local land development firm, would stop at nothing to get it. Their true aim was becoming painfully clear. They were going to pressure her until she sold. When they finally left, Eleanor did not watch them go. She turned to the workshop, the barn, and the land that had always been her home. She was being boxed in, surrounded by a quiet war waged through legal threats and silent coercion. She needed help, but not from lawyers in town who bowed to influence. She needed someone who understood land, someone who valued loyalty over fear. She found her first ally at a rusty gate off Mill Creek Road. Henry Walker was a retired surveyor and one of Samuel's old friends. He once mapped the entire stretch of Whispering Ridge before developers ever touched it. Now he spent most of his days in quiet retirement. But when Eleanor asked for help reviewing property lines, he didn't hesitate. Old loyalty still mattered in rural towns. Henry spent hours walking the property perimeter. His weathered boots moved with careful purpose, eyes sharp to even the smallest disruption in land markers. When he returned to the house at dusk, his jaw was tight, a sign of bad news. He had found several freshly moved boundary stakes placed without Eleanor's knowledge. Someone had adjusted the maps. Someone had altered the lines of her land. Developers had pushed boundaries literally. They had cut off part of her western field and absorbed it into the HOA's development map. And worse, Henry discovered survey tags leading deeper into her property markings for future construction. Someone was planning to bulldoze part of her land and had done so under the cover of paperwork. It was trespass, it was illegal, and someone had done it with quiet precision. This was no longer just a dispute with an HOA board, this was land theft. Henry urged Eleanor not to go to the county commissioners just yet. Whispering Ridge development had political ties. Complaints would disappear before they reached a courtroom. Instead, he advised gathering evidence, proof that land stakes had been moved, proof of fraudulent maps, and proof of HOA misconduct. No accusations without proof. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The house felt haunted with the heaviness of Samuel's absence. He had been a builder, he had fought droughts, storms, and debt, but even he had never imagined a future where paper and greed could steal land as easily as a thief in the night. Eleanor stood in the workshop doorway, hands trembling, but not from fear. Something inside her had hardened, something had awakened. She would not sell, she would not surrender, she would not be erased. If they wanted a war, she would give them one. The next day, the first move came from her. She drove to the county record's office again, but this time not to search but to request certified historical records. She asked for every filed land map, every deed revision, every architectural application, every financial disclosure from the Whispering Ridge Estates HOA. The clerk tried to discourage her, explaining the volume would be massive. Eleanor didn't care, she ordered everything. What she found was more than she expected. Quiet patterns emerged, HOA board members approving property variances for friends, awarding construction contracts to relatives, and issuing fines selectively against long-standing landowners. Some violations were forgiven for cash payments not recorded in official ledgers. Others disappeared entirely from public records but remained in HOA bank statements as miscellaneous income. Someone had been skimming, someone had been burying files. Corruption wasn't just present, it had roots. Eleanor began building a timeline, organizing evidence. She created folders, labeled files, and took photographs of documents. She wasn't a lawyer, but she was thorough, determined, and relentless. If the HOA wanted to weaponize paperwork, then she would bury them with their own records. But as her proof grew stronger, so did the danger. 3 trucks began circling past her property late at night. Men she didn't recognize slowed down near her fence line. Someone parked outside her gate and watched her through binoculars. A dead raccoon appeared nailed to her fence post as a warning. Someone wanted to intimidate her. Someone wanted her scared. Eleanor didn't break, she didn't show fear. Instead, she installed trail cameras around the property, hidden silent watchers. She recorded every vehicle, every plate number, every trespass. They thought she was alone, they thought she was weak, but they hadn't yet seen what a determined widow could do when pushed into a corner. On day 3 after the ultimatum, an envelope arrived taped to her mailbox. Thick red letters screamed "Final Notice, lien imminent," but Eleanor didn't tear it down. Instead, she took a photograph of it, because now every threat they made was becoming evidence. The war had officially begun. And Eleanor Hayes, a quiet widow with no power and no influence, had just committed to the one thing the HOA never expected. She would fight, and she would not fight alone. Because Whispering Ridge was about to discover something ruthless and immovable. That land remembers its people, and a community remembers injustice. And when truth rises from the ground, it brings destruction. The wind carried change across Whispering Ridge, quiet at first, then persistent, like a rumor gathering strength until it became a force that could no longer be ignored. Eleanor had spent the last several days turning her home into a war room. Her dining table had become a battlefield of files, photographs, financial records, property maps, and surveillance images. What began as a fight over her husband's workshop was transforming into something much larger, a full-scale investigation into the corrupt veins of the Whispering Ridge HOA. Her evidence was no longer scattered fragments, it was beginning to form a story. A story of greed disguised as community standards, of power built on intimidation and falsified paperwork, of stolen land and hidden money. She had the beginnings of a case strong enough to raise questions, but questions were not enough. She needed witnesses, she needed proof that others had suffered under the HOA's control. But in a small town, people feared retaliation. Whispering Ridge was known for crushing resistance. Those who challenged the system either sold their land, moved away, or disappeared into quiet compliance. No one wanted to become a target, no one wanted to stand alone. Yet Eleanor had something the HOA did not: integrity, patience, and the trust of those who had known her for years. She didn't beg for help. She didn't persuade with empty promises, she simply let the truth speak. Her first ally emerged without warning. It happened on a cold morning just as dawn broke when a farmer named Raymond Dyer pulled his old truck into her driveway. He was a neighbor she barely knew, quiet, simple, and scarred by work. He stood in silence for a long time, staring at the workshop as if it brought back memories. Then he handed Eleanor an envelope. Inside were copies of HOA notices and fines, threats identical to the ones she had received. The HOA had forced him to tear down his father's old barn, calling it structurally obsolete. It had stood for 80 years, it was part of his heritage, they had destroyed it under threat of lien and legal seizure. He did not ask for help, he did not offer a speech, he simply gave Eleanor the records and left, but that was all she needed, her first piece of community testimony. Then another came, an elderly widow named Lydia Moore who had been forced to remove the livestock pen her late husband had built. Then a mechanic named Joe Buckley, whose home business had been shut down by the HOA. Then a single mother who received fines for allowing her children's bicycles on her front porch. One by one they came, people who had suffered, people who had been silenced, people who had been waiting for someone to fight back. The story was spreading, whisper by whisper across the valley. Not a story of rebellion but of justice. As the mountain air grew sharper with winter's approach, Eleanor hosted her first secret meeting. It wasn't held in a hall or a bar or a church. It was held in Samuel's workshop on sacred ground. 17 people gathered that night. Farmers, teachers, tradesmen, retired soldiers, ordinary people who had been bullied by a force they were told they could not challenge. They sat on hay bales and overturned buckets and wooden stools, surrounded by the tools Samuel once used. It was not a meeting, it was the beginning of resistance. Some brought letters, others brought financial records, some came only to listen. But every person in that room made a silent pledge: the HOA would not divide them anymore. Eleanor did not lead them with fiery speeches, she led them by purpose. She laid out the evidence she had collected: fraudulent property mappings, suspicious financial activity, survey violations, unauthorized land annexations. She revealed something few knew, that HOA members had profited from land seizures by reselling portions of annexed land through shell companies. And every paper trail led back to one name: Meredith Crane. The woman who had tried to take Eleanor's land was not just power-hungry, she was orchestrating a land-snatching scheme to enrich herself and her circle. But proof was not enough. They needed to make this undeniable. They needed to make it public. They needed to expose the corruption not through lawyers but through truth. One man in the workshop that night would become critical: Tyler Briggs, a quiet ranch hand who rarely spoke. But he had a talent Eleanor didn't: technology. He could build a website, share files, track documents, and record witness testimonies. He agreed to create a digital archive, something impossible to destroy or erase, something that would preserve their evidence even if the HOA tried to bury it. Eleanor's army wasn't made of weapons, it was made of proof. As the days passed, her fight gathered momentum. Anonymous envelopes were left in her mailbox containing board meeting minutes never meant to be seen by the public. Contractor invoices revealed inflated payments, proof of money laundering through HOA projects. One source revealed something darker: an email chain where board members discussed forcing out legacy landowners so property values could be optimized. They had used that phrase as justification for harassment, for intimidation, for displacement. The HOA had underestimated her. They had mistaken her silence for weakness, but the land had taught Eleanor patience, and grief had taught her endurance. She was no longer defending a workshop. She was defending the people who had built this valley long before outsiders came with their rules and entitlement. But Whispering Ridge was not blind. The board knew something was shifting. They responded the only way bullies know how: through escalation. Unmarked vehicles began parking near Eleanor's road again. Motion alarms were triggered in the night. Deep tire ruts appeared behind her barn, proof of trespassers slipping onto her land. The sheriff's department refused to respond to her reports. Calls went unanswered. Messages disappeared. The law was no longer neutral. Then came the most blatant attack. One morning, Eleanor discovered orange demolition stakes hammered into the ground behind her barn, freshly placed, marked with construction tags bearing the initials WRD Development. These stakes were not warnings, they were declarations. The HOA and Whispering Ridge Development were moving forward with plans to build on her land, even while she still owned it. They no longer cared about legal process. They believed they were untouchable, but Eleanor was not the same woman who had received that first violation letter. She had changed. She had been sharpened by injustice, hardened by loss, strengthened by purpose. She removed each stake one by one, then carried them inside the workshop and laid them on the table next to her growing pile of evidence. The message was clear: they would not take her land without a fight. Meanwhile, Tyler published the first set of public records on the website he created, ridgetruth.com. It wasn't much at first, just land maps, survey discrepancies, financial redactions, but it was enough to spark attention. Downloads began, traffic increased, people started talking, and when people talk, corruption trembles. The town was waking up, but Eleanor knew the truth of war: every gain brings retaliation, every strike invites a counterstrike. And Meredith Crane was no fool. She was calculating, vicious, patient. She would not allow her empire to crumble quietly. Eleanor's fight had gone from silent resistance to open defiance, and now something dangerous was coming. She could feel it: the way the air thickened, the way threats evolved, the way enemies grew desperate when cornered. A storm was gathering beyond the ridge, heavy and violent, and it was headed straight for her. End of chapter 3. The storm did not arrive with thunder and rain. It came disguised as silence, calculated, heavy, crawling, the kind of silence that warned of danger moving in the dark. Days passed with no new violation notices, no HOA vehicles patrolling, no contractors loitering near the fence line. The cul-de-sacs below Whispering Ridge carried on in their illusion of peace, but Eleanor Hayes knew better. This was not surrender. This was the calm of an enemy planning its next strike. Whispering Ridge Estates HOA had been cornered. The website RidgeTruthCom had begun surfacing in local conversations. Residents whispered behind closed doors about missing funds, fake architectural restrictions, and land grabs disguised as community improvement. Some board loyalists dismissed it as conspiracy, but many others did not. A seed of suspicion had been planted and it was growing. Meredith Crane and her board could feel it. Their control was slipping not by force but by exposure. And so they shifted from intimidation to strategy. If they could not silence Eleanor with fear, they would bury her with the law. The attack began with a lawsuit. A thick envelope arrived, delivered by private courier, sealed with legal arrogance. It contained a 67-page civil complaint filed in county court, Whispering Ridge Estates HOA versus Eleanor Hayes. The accusations were severe: repeated violations, harassment of board members, unauthorized recording of HOA officials, slander, property defamation, and damages exceeding $250,000. The lawsuit claimed she operated an illegal activist organization and referred to her workshop meetings as organized aggression. But the most dangerous part of the lawsuit wasn't the accusations. It was the temporary restraining order hidden inside. It declared that Eleanor was legally prohibited from accessing or altering any disputed structures on her property, including the workshop. The very heart of her resistance had just been sealed by court order. She was also ordered to appear before a judge in 10 days. Eleanor was being dragged into a battlefield she could not avoid. A courtroom fight would cost money she didn't have and time she could not lose. Worse, this order aimed to shut down her evidence gathering. The workshop was now legally off-limits to her. But the HOA had made a critical mistake. They underestimated her resolve. She read the lawsuit page by page. It dripped with manufactured offense and forged outrage. Half of the claims referenced incidents that never occurred, dark fabrications designed to smear her as hostile and unstable. But she didn't panic. She treated it like everything else in this war, an obstacle to break, not a wall to stop her. Late that night she returned to the workshop anyway. The restraining order meant nothing. This was her land, her building, her fight. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust and metal, the smell of Samuel's hands. His tools still rested exactly where he had left them. Standing in that silence gave her strength. She would not bow to paper warfare, but tonight something else was waiting for her. On the workbench lay a folder she hadn't left there. Someone had been inside the workshop. No doors were broken, no windows shattered, yet someone had invaded the only place she considered sacred. The folder was labeled simply, HOA 217. Inside were 3 pages of HOA meeting minutes from 4 years earlier, documents she had never seen before. They contained a secret vote held by the board, approval to use HOA reserve funds for covert land survey operations. Below that was a handwritten note: follow the money. A friend, someone inside the HOA, was leaking documents. This changed everything. Someone close to Meredith Crane had turned. Whether it was fear, guilt, or revenge, someone on the inside wanted the truth out. Eleanor didn't know who they were yet, but they had just handed her a weapon. The next morning she met with her growing group of allies. Henry Walker studied the new documents and confirmed what she suspected. This secret vote aligned perfectly with the timeline of illegal survey stakes being moved on properties. Tyler Briggs uploaded the files anonymously to ridgetruth.com, preserving them online before the HOA could deny their existence. The evidence was no longer just a pile of suspicions. It was becoming a trail clear enough to follow, strong enough to expose. But truth was not the only thing growing. So were the threats. Victor Saunders, the HOA treasurer, filed a police report accusing Eleanor of cyber harassment. Someone slashed the tires of Raymond Dyer's truck in broad daylight. Lydia Moore found her fence destroyed. Whispering Ridge wasn't just watching now. It was striking back, and behind each attack was the same message: stop or pay. Instead, they pushed harder. Tyler and Eleanor found a pattern in HOA financial records, payments written to a company called Greenstone Community Management, all marked as reserve fund allocation. A quick business search revealed the company didn't exist. It had no physical office, no employees, no tax ID. It was a shell, and the registered owner of Greenstone was none other than Victor Saunders. He had been stealing HOA money and funneling it into his own pocket through fake maintenance fees, and he had done it for years. This was criminal fraud, the kind that could destroy people, the kind that could put people in prison. But Eleanor's enemies were planning something far darker. On the 5th night after the lawsuit arrived, she found her home under surveillance again. But this time it wasn't just random trucks. It was a team, 3 men dressed in dark clothing standing beyond the tree line watching the house through long lenses. They were professionals, they moved with purpose, they didn't hide. This was intimidation, pure and calculated. Henry urged Eleanor to stay inside. Tyler advised moving documents offsite, but Eleanor refused to retreat. Instead, she set a trap. She installed new trail cameras, but not just anywhere. She placed them inside decoy birdhouses hidden behind the barn inside fence posts. She set motion sensors along her driveway, and most importantly, she left a false binder of evidence inside the workshop in plain sight. The binder was filled with fabricated information, fake land maps, altered financial ledgers, meaningless legal scribbles, all designed to look important. Then she waited. Just past midnight, the trap closed. A vehicle without headlights rolled slowly down her road and stopped near the barn. Two men stepped out wearing gloves, moving like phantoms. They picked the workshop lock and slipped inside. 4 minutes later, they emerged carrying the decoy binder. The cameras captured everything: faces, license plates, timestamps. Tyler had access to an automatic upload system. Before the men even made it off Eleanor's land, the footage had already been copied and stored online, backed up in 6 locations. They thought they had stolen her only leverage. In reality, they had given her something priceless: video proof of criminal breaking and entering, theft, and harassment tied directly to the HOA. Eleanor did not call the sheriff. She did not confront the intruders. She did something far more dangerous. She let them go, because now the HOA did not know she had them on record. Now the war had a new advantage: they didn't know she was watching. But while Eleanor had gained a weapon, she also now had a new fear, because someone had sent those men. The HOA was no longer acting like a civil organization. It was acting like a criminal enterprise. And somewhere behind glossy board meetings and legal letters, someone was giving orders. Someone who was afraid, and fear makes enemies reckless. Winterlight cut across the valley with sharp precision, illuminating Eleanor's workshop as if it were a stage. The room, once a place of quiet labor and memory, had transformed into a command center for justice. Maps, legal documents, surveillance footage, and digital archives covered every surface. Every item told a story, every piece of evidence a weapon. Eleanor no longer fought for a single structure. She fought for truth, for legacy, and for the land itself. And now she was ready to strike. The HOA did not realize it yet, but the tide had turned. Their arrogance, built over years of intimidation, was about to crumble under the weight of evidence. Eleanor's first step was to confront the financial skeletons buried in Whispering Ridge estates. Tyler Briggs had spent sleepless nights combing through spreadsheets, invoices, and bank records. They discovered a trail of diversion so extensive it was astonishing. Funds siphoned through shell companies, unauthorized construction contracts awarded to board members' relatives, and secret accounts labeled as reserve funds that did not exist. Every move the HOA made to legitimize these actions had been documented, carefully hidden, and now fully exposed. Henry Walker, with his decades of surveying experience, had mapped every piece of disputed property. He confirmed beyond doubt that the stakes and lot lines had been manipulated, benefiting the developers and the board while deceiving the residents. And thanks to the anonymous insider who had sent her the HOA 217 folder, Eleanor now had proof that the board had discussed these manipulations during private meetings and intentionally targeted legacy landowners like herself. It was enough to bring federal attention. The next morning, Eleanor sent the compiled evidence to a federal attorney specializing in land fraud and embezzlement. The response was immediate. The documents were compelling. The irregularities, the fabricated votes, the financial diversions, and the harassment of homeowners painted a clear picture of systemic corruption. The attorney assured Eleanor that, with this material, federal authorities could launch a full investigation, an investigation that could dismantle the HOA entirely and hold its members accountable. But Eleanor didn't wait. She had already taken another step to ensure public pressure. RidgeTruth.com was now an open archive. Residents could access financial records, see survey discrepancies, and witness firsthand the patterns of harassment against longtime landowners. Word spread fast. Local newspapers picked up the story. Social media amplified it. The quiet valley, once silenced by fear, now buzzed with awareness. People were talking, people were watching, people were demanding answers. Meredith Crane and her board could feel the shift. Their control, once absolute, was fracturing. Questions came in from residents demanding explanations. Several longtime supporters began to waver, worried about exposure and potential criminal liability. Panic spread through Whispering Ridge estates like wildfire, and then came the confrontation. A special meeting was called under the guise of community review, but Eleanor knew better. Meredith Crane expected to face her quietly, intimidate her, and regain control. Instead, Eleanor arrived with every piece of evidence meticulously organized, printed, and ready for public display. She had allies: Raymond Dyer, Lydia Moore, Tyler Briggs, Henry Walker, and dozens of homeowners who had endured the same abuse. The room, usually dominated by the board's authority, now pulsed with collective resolve. Eleanor's presentation was methodical and precise. She laid out altered property maps, fraudulent votes, misappropriated funds, and secret shell companies. She revealed the tampering with land stakes, the selective enforcement of fines, and the targeted harassment of legacy owners. Every accusation Meredith Crane had ever made against Eleanor was countered with proof, and every lie was laid bare for all to see. The power dynamic had shifted. Where once the board ruled, now they were exposed. By the end of the presentation, the room was silent. Board members, including Meredith, attempted to assert authority, but their voices faltered under the weight of truth. They could argue in small, controlled settings, but not in front of the people whose trust they had violated. Public scrutiny was their most feared enemy, and Eleanor had unleashed it fully. Federal investigators, now aware of the situation through Eleanor's attorney, arrived within days. They began auditing every financial transaction, reviewing every meeting minute, and cross-referencing documents for authenticity. The HOA had no chance to cover their tracks. Every scheme, every misappropriated dollar, every fabricated fine was documented, verified, and now criminally significant. Meredith Crane attempted to negotiate quietly, threats, bribes, and offers to resign under vague terms. But Eleanor had learned long ago that compromise with corrupt forces only invites further exploitation. She refused to back down. This was not about negotiation. This was about justice. Soon, the first indictments were announced. Federal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and obstruction of justice were filed against the HOA board. Victor Saunders, the treasurer, was caught attempting to transfer additional funds offshore, only to be halted by authorities who had used Eleanor's evidence to preempt his escape. Meredith Crane faced criminal charges for conspiracy, coercion, and falsifying official documents. Other board members, fearing similar consequences, surrendered quietly. Some resigned, some attempted to flee. All were contained. The organization that had ruled with fear for over a decade was unraveling. The residents of Whispering Ridge watched as a symbol of accountability took form. Homes that had been threatened, barns that had been slated for demolition, workshops that had been targeted, all were now safe. The oppressive presence of the HOA was replaced with federal oversight and community-driven governance. The valley, once silent under fear, breathed again. Eleanor, however, did not celebrate immediately. She returned to Samuel's workshop where the tools still hung in perfect order. The fight had been won, but the victory was solemn. She knew that justice was rarely clean, rarely easy, and always came with scars. But the land had endured, the community had endured, and most importantly, the truth had prevailed. Over the following weeks, federal investigators publicly credited Eleanor Hayes for the uncovering of the corruption. Whispering Ridge residents rallied around her. Letters of support poured in. Stories were written not only about her fight but about her courage in the face of intimidation and the power of persistence. The valley remembered, and it celebrated, a single woman who refused to bend. The HOA's offices were shuttered, its accounts frozen, and its members either indicted or under investigation. For the first time in decades, the association existed only as a cautionary tale, a reminder that power unchecked breeds corruption and that the land itself remembers those who protect it. Eleanor walked the fields at dusk, the air crisp, the horizon wide and open. The storm that had been brewing over Whispering Ridge had passed, leaving a calm clarity. Her gaze fell on the workshop, still standing, still proud. Every nail, every beam, every echo inside carried Samuel's memory, and now the memory of their victory. But Eleanor also knew that vigilance was eternal. Corruption could arise anywhere, in any form, subtle and persistent. Her role, it seemed, was not only to defend her land but to guard the integrity of her community. And she was ready. The valley whispered in wind and grass, and Eleanor listened. She had unearthed the truth buried beneath years of deceit. She had faced fear, intimidation, and danger, and she had triumphed. And though the battle was hard fought, it had created a story that would resonate for generations. One widow, one workshop, and the unwavering courage to bury the HOA in justice. The fight had ended, but the legend of Eleanor Hayes had just begun. The final snowmelt of winter carved silver threads across Whispering Ridge, and as the land awakened, so too did its people. Fields thawed, rivers ran full, and families stepped out from months of quiet resolve, ready to rebuild what corruption had tried to break. The weight that had once gripped the valley was gone, replaced slowly by a cautious but growing hope. The HOA signs that once guarded every road into Whispering Ridge, bold, oppressive reminders of control, had been torn down by the residents themselves. Where they had stood, wooden posts remained like empty grave markers. The association had been dissolved through federal order, its structure dismantled, its operations frozen, and its former board awaiting trial. The grip of the HOA had finally been broken. But for Eleanor Hayes, the battle's end brought not celebration, but quiet reflection. The workshop still stood where Samuel had left it, and now it bore a second purpose, no longer merely a place of memory but a monument to resistance, truth, and resolve. It had outlasted greed, intimidation, and legal warfare. It had stood when almost everything else seemed lost. Some in town called it unbreakable, others called it sacred. To Eleanor it was home. Yet even in victory she understood something vital: justice was never permanent. Power, once displaced, always sought new ground, and as the valley moved into recovery it did so with unspoken caution. Whispering Ridge was free but fragile. Federal proceedings against the HOA board moved slowly but steadily. News spread beyond the county, beyond the state. Journalists from across the country descended upon the valley to cover what was now being called the Whispering Ridge Revolt, a story about one woman's fight against a corrupt HOA that led to the collapse of an entire criminal ring. Eleanor saw none of them. She gave no interviews. She accepted no invitations. She wasn't interested in fame or recognition. She cared about one thing only: protecting the land and people that Samuel had loved. Across the valley, neighbors who had once whispered fearfully now spoke with conviction. Landowners who had nearly lost their homes began repairing barns, rebuilding fences, reclaiming livestock, and planting fields again. Lydia Moore reopened her animal sanctuary, now stronger than before. Raymond Dyer expanded his lumber yard, hearing young men from town who needed work. Henry Walker purchased surveying equipment to help residents legally restore old boundary lines. And Tyler Briggs, who had once lived quietly in the cabin at the edge of the ridge, emerged as one of the valley's strongest voices, helping establish a new model of community governance that did not allow power to concentrate again. The people had changed. They had seen what silence allowed, and they vowed never to let it happen again. Still, storms brewed quietly on distant horizons. Lawsuits from victims of the HOA poured in. Insurance companies resisted payouts. Corrupt developers tried to keep their land claims alive in court. Some residents still faced legal impacts from fraudulent liens placed on their homes. Justice, Eleanor knew, was not a door you walk through, it was a long road you must keep walking. And so she did. Spring settled into the valley with the promise of renewal. On a quiet dawn, Eleanor walked to the highest ridge overlooking her land, her boots sinking into damp soil. Below her, Whispering Ridge unfolded in sweeping pasture and forested foothills, a place both wild and fragile, resilient yet scarred. She carried with her a wooden box, Samuel's old keepsake box carved from cherry wood. Inside were letters, photos, a folded flag, and a small brass nameplate that once rested on his workbench. She knelt in the grass and opened the box. The wind moved gently around her, almost as if it paused to listen. She traced her hand over the nameplate engraved with two words, Samuel Hayes, Builder. He had built everything that mattered, their home, their life, their dreams, and even now, years after his passing, he had helped build this victory. Because everything she had fought for, every inch of land defended, every false charge overturned, had come from a life they had built together. She pressed the brass plate into the earth. Her voice did not break, she did not weep, she stood in strength, not sorrow. Samuel had believed that land was more than property, it was responsibility. That belief now belonged to her, and soon she hoped to all who called Whispering Ridge home. Over the next week, something unexpected began to happen. Community leaders approached her not to praise her but to ask for help. They wanted guidance, not authority. They wanted her voice, not her control. They asked her to help form the new community charter, a framework that would govern Whispering Ridge without corruption, without hierarchy, without tyranny. They wanted Eleanor Hayes, the woman who had buried the HOA, to help build something new in its place. She did not answer immediately. She took time to think, walking the edges of her land at night under the endless sky. She wasn't a politician, she wasn't a speaker, she had never wanted power, and she still didn't. But she did understand something most never would, how fragile freedom truly was, and how fast it could be taken from those who worked the land quietly, trusting others to do what is right, and more importantly, she had no fear left. So one bright June morning in the old Grange Hall, she stood before every resident of Whispering Ridge. There was no podium, no stage, just a single woman standing among neighbors. She spoke simply, with steady conviction. She talked about land, about heritage, about responsibility, about the price of silence and the power of truth. She reminded the valley that they had almost lost everything, not to force but to fear. And she told them what must come next: unity, transparency, courage. By the time she finished, the hall stood in silent agreement, not applause, not cheers, just the strong, deep stillness of shared understanding. Whispering Ridge would never again be ruled, it would be owned by its people. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor helped write the new charter. It protected land rights, it outlawed forced homeowner associations, it established a council, not a board, where decisions required community vote and real oversight. It ensured that no outside developer could ever again exploit residents through intimidation or deceit. The charter passed unanimously. Life began to move forward, families rebuilt, farmers tilled the earth, neighbors helped neighbors again. And for the first time in years, the valley was free. One evening, as sunlight faded through the barnwood slats of the workshop, Eleanor walked inside and ran her hand across the old workbench. Samuel's tools remained neatly hung, but now new tools hung beside them, evidence of something rebuilt, not just preserved. Sometimes she wondered why she had survived all this, why fate had made her the one to carry this burden.